Welcome to the third installment of the Leftynet Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob, and today I have with me our host, John. For our first topic, we will be talking about the future of Leftynet. We've been on what you could call a hiatus for quite a while, and we've had like server changes and moderation changes, and yeah, there's been just a general administration chaos that has prolonged the startup of this project again. But since things have stabilized and people have a lot more free schedules, including myself, we will be doing monthly podcasts at the end of the month, and we will also be doing a lot of random videos regarding recent events and, well, potential other articles, etc., etc. And a lot of these articles will also be uploaded to our WordPress blog, and yeah, you can just expect a lot of content coming your way on this channel, and you will also be notified about this if you are on either Discord that we will link in the description below, and you can also follow us on our new Twitter that we recently set up because of we lost access to the previous one. And yeah, John, do you have anything to say about the future?
Yeah, like you said, we've had a general administrative issues just plague the production of both videos and articles for the last 6 months or so. Um, I know our last video was in August, I think. It was 6 months ago.
Yeah,
So we haven't been really doing anything, and that's not because we haven't had the time to, but it's mainly because it's we've had an extremely hard time um, keeping everything at check and making sure that everything's stable enough to start making videos, especially on a set schedule. And
yeah,
we will be working monthly, mainly doing monthly recaps of events and things like that. And depending on how big events are in that month, shorter 15 to 30 minute podcasts, just focusing on one event. A good example of this might be Afrin, if something happens like that next month, or whatever, just anything in that general line. But the general consensus for right now is that we're hoping to have at least 12 podcasts a year,
yeah, exactly.
and each podcast is hopefully going to be 30 to 45 minutes long. That being the basis. So nothing overly long or with too many topics, and we're going to try to specialize ourselves more in podcasts and not be all over the place with
Yeah,
our
exactly.
topics.
Well, so for first, event or topic is that, well, there's been recent protests in Russia quite a lot, and it is mainly due to the detainment of one of the political oppositional leaders in the Russian election. Now, since, well, I guess you could say like December, they've already pretty much assured that Vladimir Putin would actually win the election again. Surprise, surprise. There's been high notes of corruption ever since his, well, entering into politics. Things have just gotten worse as the years have progressed. There's been political assassinations. Actually, last year, there was a political assassination of one of his oppositions, and now one has been detained. And the protests were obviously a reaction to that. Now, one of the oppositions actually came out and said that this is not an election and we should not act if as it was one. And yeah, people are not happy about this. I think people have had enough, especially now considering that um, I think it's the fifth um, re-election of Putin, if not the sixth even, and things are not getting better as far as corruption and leadership is going. I think last year there was a scandal, and there's been previous ones as well, but for the Duma election, there was voter fraud, and that caused a lot of controversy. And you can see that on video footage as well. But there's a lot of issues with Russia's democracy and obvious economic mode of production, but corruption and Putin being pretty much a dictator at this point, arresting leaders, or not arresting leaders, but arresting political oppositions, assassinating oppositions. This is not at all. It's not even a facade of democracy anymore. It's just, yeah, it's just corrupted leadership and dictatorship. Um, Even if the people has had enough of it, I'm not sure there's not much they can do actually about that. Um, so I don't know. Do you think that they're relevant still, John? Like, are the people actually able to do anything about it, do you think, or will things take a change for the next election? Because what I saw like a month ago was that Putin seemed a lot more nervous than he used to be in other elections. And there's been multiple articles about that, saying that uh, even for such a leader as Putin, he's still nervous about the election. That probably explains why they detained the political oppositions. And I think there's something going on, but it can be internal issues. It can be, um, yeah, it can be whatever. It can be NATO, for as long as I know. But
Yeah,
what are your thoughts on all of this?
I feel like when it comes to Russian opposition to Putin, there's two ways this can go, and it's for two reasons. Um, both ways that it can go are relatively the same path. Um, the issue with protests as of right now isn't that there are protests, which there obviously should be protests, no doubt about that. But the issue is that there's no clear cut opposition for the protests. There's no, I don't feel, there's nothing structured well enough to make people feel on a widespread level that the opposition is prepared to either do something about the current affairs, the status quo, um, or to really organize above small citywide protests. Um, the second way that this can go is just a complete dissolution of the protests. I feel like the post Soviet Union fear of collapse is still there in
Definitely.
Russia, and I feel like the economic turmoil in Russia is definitely still there in terms of the fear of it getting worse. So I feel like, although it is good to say that there are protests, I don't think anything will come out of this. And of course, Putin will be nervous about this election because this is the first election that he has where widespread chaos has been this prevalent. But I think he's worried not because there are protests, but because this is the first time that there have been protests on such a level. Not that anything's going to happen, but it still is an indication of discontent. And I feel like a lot of people, even though they take part in the protests, are eternally still scared of losing stable Russia. And I feel like that's what they want to maintain. And they don't really have any um, structure or organization past that, be past just I want to maintain. Um, and although there are candidates for opposition, you do need this structured hierarchical um, organization of who you want to replace, especially if it's just going to be, on a capitalist to capitalist basis. If you're not changing
Yeah.
anything, you definitely need this kind of organization, which they have failed to show. I believe.
Yeah, no, I agree. Also, as a side note, before we move on to the next topic, actually, Pussy Riot has been seeking exile into Sweden, and seeing, we have a very like feminist and I would say like still punk-esque culture. They're very welcomed, obviously, but there's been a documentary on them recently, and for the state of like how people have been going against, I guess like the counterculture of Russia, hasn't really been a an authentic counterculture, as with any like nation state and any type of authoritarian rule, even if it's, well, not officially authoritarian. Um, Everything is controlled to some extent, and especially regarding sexuality, regarding, well, religious beliefs. Russia has been strictly conservative and orthodox for a very long time, and I feel it's interesting to see now that well, acts like Pussy Riot are leaving the country to express themselves even better and explain the well, I guess like cultural state of Russia. And I'm looking forward to seeing other artists and other, um, yeah, like forms of, yeah, other people who can express themselves in different ways move to places where they can do that freely. And I think that people are just getting tired, especially people who have something to say and something to go against the current order. I think that they're just getting tired of living in that kind of area and that kind of rule. So that was just an interesting side note. But for our, unless you have something else to add about that, I think we can move on to the current development of ISIS in Syria.
Yeah. The one thing that I do want to add specifically towards Russia is just as a final last word of mine. I do feel that this is going to be the issue. This has always been the issue with protests, especially civil ones, that don't truly change to or seek a change in the systemic management of the country. They have anger, which is very prevalent. Everybody can agree that they do have anger, um, but it's not specialized anywhere. It's I'm upset with this. It's not I'm upset with this, and this is how I want to change it. Um,
Yeah,
but I think now would be a good time to transition to ISIS. Yeah.
exactly. So there's definitely been a huge development in Syria. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So ISIS compared to last year, this time last year, and the year before that, ISIS has been on a steady decline from both Syria and Iraq, being almost entirely pushed out, if not entirely pushed out of Iraq, as we're speaking. Um, but what's going on right now with ISIS is that they have been reduced to such a small size, um, comparably to, years before this one. Now only controlling, now with their main defense only being in a river, or near a river in southern Syria, um, and after that being split up into two or three more pockets. Um, but as of right now, ISIS is in a very, very precarious predicament. They do have no more land to take. They're at a point where the only people that they can successfully assault are other opposition groups within Syria, which they're either not close to or have already done. And the main issue with ISIS is that they have failed to close out the pockets, and they have failed to um, reunite the pockets into one form. You can especially see this with how it is split up, and there will be a link to current Syria in the description below. But as of right now, ISIS is in a very, very tricky spot, and they have been reduced to attacks in other countries, specifically Libya and specifically Afghanistan. Recently, in Afghanistan and Kabul, they did find quite a few ISIS hiding spots, not necessarily trying to plan attacks, but trying to flee or just trying to lay low for right now. But yeah, I definitely think the current state of ISIS is how it's always been. It has been deteriorating, but since it's been deteriorating for so long, there's only so fast it can deteriorate now. Progress still is slow, and that is because even though they are a small force, especially in the terms of land mass in Syria, they still do have an extremely, extremely strong sense of duty. So it has been extremely hard to finally close out and to defeat ISIS, and they have made some progress in growing back again, especially in other pockets, taking over opposition towns and essentially wherever they border opposition, they have been um, taking over or unifying that land. with a notable exception being the Idlib pocket.
Okay.
But I'm interested to
Like,
see how you think or how you feel about ISIS. Where do you think that they will go in this state? What will their last measures be to sustain the state
so,
or to grow it again?
when it comes to ISIS, like, there's a lot of different terrorist organizations that have come and gone the past decade. Uh, regarding ISIS, as far as like their mobilization and geographical, well, I guess like their territorial their territorial contestations, I feel like it's too chaotic to do any kind of prediction as of now. But when it comes to all these kinds of terrorist organizations, I feel like they've grown a lot smarter and a lot more resilient. And even though, like, on a surface level, they may appear as simple pawns in regards to the rest of like the militaristic superpowers, but and like not really a huge threat to world peace or any kind of international relations. If anything, they're good to use as like a black sheep and move attention away from other political threats, whether it's Turkey invading Syria, etc., etc. But I think they won't disappear for at least a couple of years, if I have to be honest. Like, a lot of political leaders have been, uh, well, claiming to, I wouldn't say a lot, but there's been statements where people have said that they hope to eradicate ISIS in a short time, and I find that to be very unlikely. And I think they will try their best to, in any way possible, at least maintain their power level at the current state. Um, and I'm not sure what they will do or how they will try to achieve that. But I'm not seeing ISIS going away anytime soon. I think they will use technology in a much more efficient way, and perhaps they will go a little bit more quietly about it. There's a lot of money involved regarding ISIS, obviously, and I can see that's a bit cynical maybe to think that, but I could see political oppositions and like in regards to different well, like if you had the United Nations, the United States, the Middle East, I could see these different actors using ISIS to, well, for different I wouldn't really call it as a weapon, but you can certainly arrange some type of, I wouldn't even say distraction, but I could see them being used as some kind of political pawn in order to further their uh, goals.
Yeah,
That is, like, whether it's like United States and Syria. For example, the United States have accused Syria very recently now for developing chemical weapons again, and you could obviously see how that could be used, but I doubt that anything major will happen, at least this year, on any level. I think people will just try to maintain their power structure, and I don't see them going away anytime soon.
yeah. I definitely have to agree here. I feel like ISIS is, if not the biggest geopolitical excuse right now. Um,
Yeah.
I think you can see this a lot um, with Turkey's involvement in ISIS. Um, Turkey, as of recently, uh, or with captures of ISIS fighters from both Raqqa and from areas that ISIS have controlled, the YPG have shown that Turkish border guards and Turkish government endorsed and escorted um, ISIS militants over the border, especially into Syria, and places like Al-Bab, Jarablus, Azaz, places like that. So I think that if it's one place that has used ISIS as an excuse while supporting it, I do think it has to be Turkey, mainly
Yeah,
because
definitely.
Turkey has taken advantage of the chaotic situation, especially with the attacks on Afrin, which are still going on, um, using ISIS as the main excuse, calling the YPG, extensions of the PKK and the extensions of ISIS, um, as well as trying to further their own geopolitical goals in the region. I think you can look at this with the funding of the opposition forces by Turkey, specifically ISIS, and specifically the forces around the Idlib pocket, and the attacks on YPG and Operation Euphrates Shield. Turkey seems to have a very, very strong want to establish itself as a regional power, um, specifically in Syria, just because, not just because, but taking advantage of the situation. And I think that as time goes on, um, I do think that depending on how much they truly do want to stake their claim, I do believe that Turkey is willing to risk quite a lot in pursuit of this power, specifically going against the wishes of NATO allies. And this can all be seen by a lessened amount of attacks and fights and participation in the fight against ISIS, and more in the funding of them to keep the situation in Syria as unstable um, and as a region with plenty issues. But speaking of unstable regions, I do
Yeah.
believe our next topic is the KPP, and the PKK in northern Iraq.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Well, I mean,
no, go ahead.
no, I'm awfully in regards to KPP, I'm more curious to learn about them than anything, but it's such a chaotic state right now. So I'd rather just let you enlighten me on the topic.
Yeah. So we all know how embarrassing uh, it was last year to see the Peshmerga and to see the Kurdish autonomous government in northern Iraq blatantly walk out of Erbil with absolutely no contesting of that. I feel like Iraqi Kurdistan, although not definitively aligned with our ideology, um, and with not definitively aligned with the same goals as the YPG and other organizations with that, did have a chance to establish themselves as some sort of even more autonomous or even free region, um, post ISIS. But I feel like they've crucially failed that due to both the corruption in Iraq and the corruption within this region, which does stem from an absolute mismanagement of autonomous regions in the Middle East, specifically going as far back as the partition of the Ottoman Empire. Um, so I do feel like um, it has been embarrassing, and because of this, you do have organizations like the KPP or the PKK coming in and setting up almost small states within northern Iraq, um, and because of this, not only has northern Iraq allowed Turkey to just to airstrike these forces in northern Iraq, as far as 20 miles in, but they've also blatantly gone against them, which is nothing surprising given their ideology. But I do think that the state of Iraqi Kurdistan is much more desperate than the state of Rojava at the moment.
Hmm. Well, I mean, speaking of Rojava, like maybe it's a good time to go over, well, like democratic confederalism as a whole ideology. Because I know you have a lot to say about it. I'm fairly recent to it. I recently read Apu's, well, his description of the entire ideology, but I feel you being a supporter of this for a long time could probably uh, reach into it a bit better, I can imagine. Um, so, what do you like? Can you give like a briefing of Rojava and like the role democratic confederalism has played into it for the last decade, I guess?
Yeah, so Rojava has been a autonomous region of Syria for quite a while. Um, and before the Syrian civil war, it was dominated by three different Kurdish parties, or Kurdish factions, I guess you could say. Um, with the YPG being a part of that, or not, but something along the lines of the YPG being a part of that. Um, Much more complicated than just saying that. But as of for right now, democratic confederalism has taken over the other beliefs that were there before the Syrian civil war, and has essentially been the governing factor of Rojava. Um, but the main progress of democratic confederalism that we have seen um, is the kind of stabilization of minority communities. Of course, Apo made and formulated democratic confederalism out of the situation of the Kurds and the Middle East specifically. Um, and using that, you have seen in his book, Democratic Confederalism, um, you do see that. It is specifically designed for areas like this where racial, religious, and and cultural tensions have persuaded an area for quite a long time. Because going as far back as you want into history, the Middle East has always been different from from the regions around it. You don't really have as stable of borders when it comes to these kind of ethnic lines. Um, in Europe or Asia or Russia or anything like that. And I mean, you could make the argument of maybe Chechnya or Dagestan and things like that, but it is really an issue and region of its own when it comes to these issues. And that's what democratic confederalism has been trying to work out. And I think it has been working out with major success. We will have to see how it works out in the future, um, especially for Rojava, because as Rojava has expanded and has taken over areas of Arab majority, or that have a significant Arab population, notably Raqqa, we don't have a very good basis for how they feel about it. We know that people like this, and we know that they really do like this a lot more than they like ISIS, but the Arab opinion, especially in Raqqa, is unknown for right now, just because it is a very still, especially for the Arab population, is a very turmoilous time, and it is a time in their history where there has been three changes in governments since 2014, 2011. Even if you're counting the base protests, you do have ISIS, you do have opposition forces, you do have the Syrian Arab Army, and the SAA and Assad and things like that, and now you do have the YPG. So although I do believe that the YPG and Rojava as a whole will eventually come to be an example of what to aspire for, especially in a social revolution, and especially in a way of going about solving these issues, it is really early to say how far they will get and what they want, especially for Kurdish autonomy or for Kurdish independence as a whole in Syria. But I do think that no matter what does go down in Syria and Kurdistan, I am steadfast in the belief that Rojava as a whole will defend it to the last man, and you can see that in Afrin, and you could see that in
Oh yeah.
Kobani, and you could see that in Raqqa, and how much progress they've made in really demonstrating their will and their strength as a force, and specifically as a united group of peoples.
So before I go into the future and like some general questions about democratic confederalism, Could you could you go a little bit more deeper into the events taking place in Afrin? Because I found that to be very interesting.
So the events taking place in Afrin, as a precursor, you do have Operation Euphrates Shield, which Turkey did support, which was a expansion into Syria, um, for really no reason, if you look at it. Um, but the attacks on Afrin have been supported by Turkey, supported by the Turkish military, and they have been using captured ISIS militants as fighters to fight against Afrin. And and it is truly a very, very, very tricky situation right now. Um, you have Turkey accusing the YPG of releasing and using ISIS militants as fighters, which there's really been absolutely no proof of. There's proof of the YPG and Rojava as a whole treating ISIS militants humanely and not and not throwing them in gulags or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
you do see a very, very, very um, strong connection between ISIS fighters somehow appearing wherever, or previous ISIS fighters somehow appearing everywhere you go in northern Afrin, and and Turkish soldiers. But essentially, Afrin is truly what Turkey is going for. Turkey has already stated that they do want a buffer zone in Syria, and that's what they're supposedly trying to get out of this. But I think it's quite clear that what they want is not to return it back to Assad or to crush the American imperialist puppet state of Rojava,
Okay.
but it's quite clearly for their own geopolitical goals and attributions, um, and and uh, and aspirations and attributions, which can, going back, you can see connections between the suppression of Armenian, Georgian, and other minorities in the Ottoman
Oh
Empire
yeah,
and in early
definitely.
Turkey. So, depending on how far this goes, and knowing how much ultranationalism is a factor in Turkish politics, this could get very, very bloody quite quickly. And it already has, with Turkey using cluster bombs, an illegal weapon, um, on civilian targets, and specifically targeting civilian
Yeah.
targets, um, especially targeting cars and the like.
Yeah, that makes sense. About especially well, Turkey wanted to further their geopolitical aspirations, but I'm just more curious about how much of a threat like Turkey as a whole considers the YPG to be. Like considering uh, Abdullah Öcalan and Apu being like a pretty much a political prisoner for the last decade, being released and re-entered into complete isolation, where he wrote all of his books, including I think then Democratic Confederalism. Um, because I read what I read and what I found very interesting was that he has a very very optimistic view of what his ideology could be. Now he drew a lot of inspiration from Murray Bookchin and his social ecology and communalization, um, and this is a very you can call it a direct democratic political system, but what I found interesting is that it has very strong feminist or anti-patriarchal, and also, of course, anti-nation state and anti-nationalist themes written into it. And yet he seems very optimistic, seeing it could solve a lot of the issues for um, both even Turkey. And I'm actually kind of curious whether or not you think they see both Apu and Rojava as a threat through their own geopolitical powers, um, or if it's strictly just removing another political enemy. Um,
Yeah, I mean it is quite complicated, the situation. You have the PKK
yeah,
going as far back as the 1970s. Um, I do feel like that it's not a general discontent for Rojava, which they do view as a threat. I could definitely know that. They do view them as an extension of the PKK and other quote unquote terrorist organizations, which we both know to be out of self defense. If you
Yeah.
even want to call them terrorists, um, which is completely wrong at this point. Um, but I do feel like it can solve a lot of issues, and I do feel like a lot of the issues that are in Turkey have stemmed out of ultranationalism and this patriarchal society, um, which, of course, democratic confederalism wants to abolish. Um, but I do think that Turkey views them as another threat, but I also think that Turkey views them as an opportunity. Turkey has had a long history with oppressing and even going as far as genociding ethnic minorities. Um, and they can make up all the excuses that they want for, attacking these areas. Um, but the only justified ones, which they even then aren't justified, because there has been no YPG attacks on Turkish soil. Um, if they do want to attack anybody because of attacks, then they should be attacking the PKK, which they have been doing for almost 40 years now, or however long now. And essentially, Turkey's goal out of attacking Afrin, I believe, is not only just to attack what they see as an enemy, but to attack the Kurds in general. I do feel like they
Okay.
view Kurdish independence as a very, very, very threatening concept, because Turkish independence in Syria is going to spell an even bigger one for or Kurdish independence in PKK provinces, and Kurdish independence in Iraqi Kurdistan, I would think.
Oh yeah, definitely. So, there's been different, a huge victory for some Kurdistan independence in Iraq, where like 90% of the voters voted for independence. But as far as like, I don't know, like a nation for not only like Kurdistan's, but other minorities and communities that have been oppressed throughout the decades, including the Armenians. Like in the book, for example, he describes like how a lot of these different communities and minority, even though he doesn't want to refer to them as minority states or minority countries, um, in comparison to maybe like Turkey or other superpowers, they are definitely a minority, and how a system like this could benefit them a lot. But what I'm thinking about is more, is it realistic? In the sense that will anyone ever allow this to happen? If so, and this is where it gets very complicated, so I won't really ask that question, like, what are the consequences of it? But I'm thinking, like, in states like Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, seeing how patriarchal and how uh, nationalist they are, how many religious ties there are, like in this very quasi religious governance. Um, I also see a problem with like ecology being a theme in the sense that they use a lot of fossil fuels. So even though this seems like a very optimistic solution, I feel the probability that uh, these countries, in particular Iran and all the other superpowers, um, would even allow this to be allow Confederates in their country to exist, I found that very unlikely, um, regarding like their current state, culturally, uh, and geographically, and in regards to their international relations and economic situations, being dependent on oil, etc., etc. Um, but I don't know. Do you think there's a chance that this might be implemented in other democratic societies, like in Armenia, just outside Azerbaijan?
I do think that any democratic confederalism could be applied anywhere in the same with
Okay.
the same issues with as Syria or Turkey, but I do feel like democratic confederalism, although it does work and it has, worked, and with Rojava, um,
Definitely.
I feel like you are completely right on that when it comes to Iran and Turkey and Syria and Iraq, even allowing, I mean, Syria has always been more lenient towards the Kurds in
Yeah.
Rojava, especially compared to places like Iraq and Turkey, um, which have been absolutely brutal and oppressive towards these people. Go in Iraq, going as far back as Saddam Hussein, um, and then even further than that. I mean, just all throughout history, the Kurds have been ignored, um, specifically. But I do think that it depends on how things change and how things go about. Although I do feel like no country uh, wants to have a major opposition group in their country that is quite ready to break off. I do feel like with how the U.S. has taken to Rojava and how Israel has taken with Rojava, which I want to speak on in a bit, um, I do feel like there is quite enough reasons for keeping democratic confederalism alive in the Middle East, especially for nations like the U.S. and for nations like Israel. And I definitely think that wherever that democratic confederalism goes, support for it will follow. Now, whether that support will be successful
Definitely.
in getting its autonomy and getting its independence, you can't tell. I mean, we're talking about things that haven't even happened yet. But I
Yeah.
do feel like wherever democratic confederalism goes in the Middle East, there will surely be international as well as local population support for it. Um, and and of course you cannot expect the international community to come through every single time on every issue that needs to be addressed. But I do feel like the prospects for it look a lot brighter than using capitalism or any other ideology as as an alternative. And
Yeah.
I surely think that replacing the ultra Arab nationalist ideologies such as Baathism and I can't remember the word used that Oppo used for the word um, of governance in Turkey. Um, but I do feel like again, wherever democratic confederalism goes, support for it will follow, both locally and internationally.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons for that is I think the will for self-administration. And like what's good about it is that the ideology itself is open for other factions of ideology and cultures and religious entities, and it's a system that uh, works well democratically since it is consensus oriented. So it's more of I like this point especially is that even fascist states to some extent would have a confederate structure where they would have to use some kind of decentralized form of governance, taking, I don't know, more direct, more direct decision making and like allowing for self administrations and what would resemble municipal councils, etc. And I think that the will to participate in a democratic system, even if it's just a confederate and not necessarily on a nationwide scale, I think would be very huge. But yeah, as far as now, it's just speculation. But I myself, I'm very optimistic, especially in comparison to other political systems that have failed and that are way more, um, well, that are way more, how should I put it, um, absolutist and more monopolistic in regards to power. And I think, in contrast to democracy and especially direct democracy, I'm very interested in the state of Turkey in general. Seeing, well, what I would call their dictator, Erdogan, and seeing like how he has been trying to consolidate power the recent years now, like just 2 years um, behind us. And I'm not sure, like, what do you think Turkey as a whole? What is their next move in regards to, um, either consolidating the current government's power, or how they will work in regards to well, their general yeah, their general international relations. Will they be in support of certain uh, political affiliations, and collaborating with other countries that they have not collaborated with in the past? Or do you think they will remain stable as to not have any more political chaos internally or externally?
Well, I feel like no matter where you analyze Turkey, there'll always be, um, especially with Erdogan, an aggressive force towards others. And
Definitely.
I feel like with Erdogan, you do see an acceptance um, on a systemic level, on a level of the government, um, this acceptance of ultra Turkish nationalism. And I do feel like Turkey might not in the future, depending on how Afrin plays out and depending on how peace talks play out, which have been relatively unsuccessful. Um, but I do think, depending on how Afrin turns out, especially, it could change Turkey's way of approaching things. Um, we do see this rise of ultranationalism, and we do see this rise of protest against the Turkish government, especially after elections and referendums that have taken place in the last 3 years now. Um, but I do think that the general state of Turkey is at a turning point, and whether that turning point is a point that we like or not is up for debate. But the turning point is either an extremely strong, I believe, extremely strong um, government ruled basically by Erdogan, ruled by an Ottoman caliph LARPing uh, idiot who has no uh, sense of surroundings. Um, I do feel like it's either that or it is um, a maintenance of the status quo right now. If it doesn't get any worse,
Yeah,
it's going to stay the same.
exactly. Um, so moving towards the end, I'd like to make like a general, and this is like very, I don't know, like subjective, and like how I've been looking at things the last couple of years is that, well, being in favor of systems like democratic confederalism, and general decentralized systems myself, maybe not strictly anarchist, but you get the point. Um, I've been seeing a lot of trends in regards to authoritarianism, and people in general being more cynical and um, more pessimistic towards ideas such as, well, our idealist form of democracy. And I'm not sure whether that trend will settle or not. But when I look at countries like Russia, uh, or any other Middle Eastern country, I feel as if though the people in those countries, especially Russia and also Turkey, has given up any hope on a democratic system, um, that they will be able to participate. And I'm not sure whether or not that will lead into, well, rebellion, or whether people will actually seek exile in the future. Now being just like a simple band, such as just Pussy Riot seeking exile in another country, such as Sweden. You can't really make a general claim about that. But I do definitely see, when seeing Trump becoming president in the United States, and seeing how there's a lot of authoritarian moves being made, and a lot of what I would call highly militaristic, and to some extent nationalistic, bordering upon patriotism. Um, I would say that it's not looking bright. And I made this point in the past in other podcasts, but I think the hope for democracy, and this is just me personally, I think the hope for democracy and decentralized systems lie in smaller communities, such as Armenia, such as obviously Rojava, but also in third world countries where there is much higher, I would call it higher potential and higher will to, um, yeah, like liberate themselves from authoritarian rule, as in contrast to, well, I guess superpowers, hope seems a bit more blight and also not as bad, perhaps. The progression towards authoritarians consolidating power has been a lot more slower, especially in Russia, especially in Turkey. And also, I would even say the United States of America, seeing Trump being a lot more conservative, a lot more militaristic than you've seen in the past, to the point where people are even romanticizing George W. Bush, even liberals. So that is the state we are in right now, I think. Or I'm just brainwashed, but I doubt that. Um, so I'm very optimistic about smaller communities, and I'm looking forward to seeing the development of, well, even democratic confederalism, but as people wanting to liberate themselves from authoritarian rule, and especially in third world countries. So how would you say your outlook is on the future, especially this year in 2018, and in these regions we have been discussing? Is it optimistic? Is it pessimistic?
I think
What is it?
I think on a global scale, I am more optimistic than I was definitely a year or two ago. I feel like when it comes to smaller communities, or not even small communities, but just communities in general, I feel like these kind of um, power grabs in major countries, like you said, America with Trump, Turkey with Erdogan, things like that, aren't necessarily out of the strength of these systems, but out of the fear of the systems ending.
Oh yeah.
I feel like we have seen a global trend since the fall of the Soviet Union. We have seen a global trend of discontent, um, not because the Soviet Union has fallen, and not because of whatever, but for the opposite reason. I think it's because that the we've seen this discontent, um, because we now see the true effects of global capitalism, and even if people don't want our system of governance of our leftist ideologies, I do think you see a massive wave of discontent. I mean, you look at any protest within the last year or two, they're becoming increasingly large and increasingly um, more robust in what they're getting started about. Um, we have obvious things like Charlottesville and etc. But in general, I do feel like I am way more optimistic, especially because of regions like the YPG, because of the protests happening really everywhere, and because of these kind of power grabs out of desperation to maintain a system that I feel like people who support them is failing, especially Republicans in America and Turkish people or Turkish nationalists in Turkey.
Yeah, I completely concur, and I think this is a good point to end it as well. And yeah, thanks for tuning in to another installment of the Leftynet Podcast. We look forward to, well, seeing a lot more of you people tuning in, and we will be uploading this in a few days. And also, you can expect another podcast coming within a month. And probably we will have a lot more guests on in the future as well. Hopefully, you've been enjoying what you've been hearing, and you can also expect other content to be uploaded on our WordPress document. And that is all for us this evening. Thank you, and peace out.